They told you slavery ended with chains and whips. They lied. The truth was bred in silence, not shouted in the fields. It began with whispers behind candlelit doors, the kind of words that reek of God and profit in the same breath. Listen closely now. What I'm about to tell you was never meant to survive the century. The men who built this world made sure of that. They buried the truth under ledgers, family names, and southern charm. But rot seeps through the floorboards eventually, and if you listen long enough, you can still hear it breathing beneath the soil of Louisiana. In 1847, there was a plantation so efficient, so well-ordered, that not a single enslaved woman ever ran. Not one, imagine that. Decades of bondage, and every man who tried to escape was hunted, caught, displayed. Yet the women, the very heart of rebellion, of memory, of lineage, stayed. Voluntarily, the records said. Willingly, the masters whispered. You and I both know there's no such thing as willing chains. The locals called the estate Fair Haven, a name meant to sound holy, safe, civilized. But what was buried beneath that name was a system so methodical, so calculated, that even death began to look like mercy. The air around Fair Haven was different, still heavy, like something alive was listening. Travelers who passed along the old river road would see the smoke from its tobacco barn and say it smelled
sweet. They had no idea what was burning. History likes to pretend.
The horror was random, that cruelty was born from ignorance. No, this was not ignorance. This was intelligence, sharpened and turned inward. A science of subjugation, an experiment in human design, the kind of operation that required silence, blood, and faith in something darker than God. Before the war, before the ruins, before the cellar was opened, Fair Haven was a success story. Its women fetched twice the market price. Buyers said they were healthy, fruitful, strong. But those words hid another truth, one written in ledgers, carved into flesh, and hidden in the damp air beneath the barn floor. And when they finally opened that cellar, they didn't just find bones. They found records, systems, plans, proof that what happened there wasn't madness, it was method. Now take a breath. Because once we descend beneath that barn, there's no way back up. You need to understand something before we go further. Evil rarely calls itself by name. It wears order like armor, speaks in ledgers, and calls its cruelty progress. Fair Haven was not a plantation. It was a laboratory wearing a smile, and its master, Thomas Rutledge, understood the power of control better than any whip could deliver. He didn't rule by fear alone. He ruled by design. By 1847, the South was a living machine, and men like Rutledge were its engineers. He studied breeding manuals, agricultural journals, even veterinary treatises from England, anything that explained how to refine bloodlines, how to make the next generation stronger, more profitable, more fit, only he didn't apply it to cattle. He applied it to people, to women, to wombs. His neighbors thought him pious, a quiet man, a churchman, modest in his manners. They saw his restraint and called it virtue, but that composure hid something precise, something cold. He'd found a way to turn suffering into a system, and no one questioned him because he made it look civilized. The women under his control weren't chained in public. They were managed, recorded, and traded like living investments. Each name, each body, each child, logged, numbered, analyzed. The first visitors who noticed something strange at Fair Haven never spoke of it aloud. They saw the imbalance. Too many women, not enough men. They saw children vanish from the quarters, sold before they could even speak their names. But the master explained it all away with the ease of a man who'd been telling the same lie for years. Economic efficiency, he said. Selective retention. The words sounded reasonable. That's how evil hides. Behind reason. Those who came close to him said he had a fascination with perfection. He'd sit on his veranda at dusk, watching the women cross the yard, and take notes. Quiet, meticulous notes. He believed he was improving the species. He told investors in Charleston that what he was doing would elevate the race. They applauded him. They funded him, because when money and moral decay shake hands, the world looks away. And yet, none of the women ran. Not one. It wasn't loyalty. It wasn't fear. It was something far worse. A form of imprisonment so deep it rewired their instincts. You see, when the mind is trained to obey, the cage no longer needs walls. By the spring of 1859, the secret of Fair Haven had begun to whisper through Charleston's backrooms, but never in daylight. You'd hear it in the pauses between men's laughter at the taverns or in the tone of a physician describing exceptional results. They didn't call it horror. They called it innovation. The South, they said, was evolving, and behind that evolution stood a quiet plantation where women became data, living numbers in an experiment to engineer obedience and endurance. Dr. Samuel Brennan was the first outsider to see the pattern, though he didn't yet understand what he was seeing. He wasn't a radical. He was a physician, a man of reason, trained to believe that every problem had an explanation. But when he attended the Charleston auction that year, he heard something that made his blood turn to ice. The auctioneer wasn't selling a woman. He was selling a formula. "Proven fertile," the man said. 5 healthy births. No complications, superior stock, Fair Haven trained. Brennan watched as wealthy buyers from Savannah, Mobile, even Richmond, raised their bids without hesitation. They weren't buying labor. They were buying lineage. That word, lineage, carried a different weight in the 19th century. It meant purity, improvement, control. It meant that even the womb had become property. That night, Brennan asked questions in whispers. The answers came with smirks. "Ruttled breeds his own," one doctor said. "Keeps records, measures results, like a farmer with prize mares." The laughter that followed wasn't the laughter of cruelty. It was the laughter of men who believed they were discussing progress. That's the part no history book wants to explain. The monstrous things people will call moral when money agrees. Brennan's curiosity became obsession. He studied courthouse archives, bills of sale, shipment records. The pattern was precise. Children sold between ages 2 and 4, mothers retained, male population minimal. No random chaos, no traditional trade. A system. Controlled, tracked, and calculated. He began to realize that Fair Haven wasn't just a plantation. It was a prototype. Each record led deeper into something deliberate. Each ledger entry felt like a cipher for a truth too large to name. He didn't yet know what lay beneath the tobacco barn, or why every woman stayed, but he could feel the shape of it forming, a darkness wearing the mask of order, a network of control that didn't end with chains, but began with the mind. In March of 1862, Brennan finally set foot on Fair Haven soil. The war had begun to gnaw at the edges of the South, but inside those acres, the system still pulsed, calm, deliberate, untouched. The overseer, Harold Gaines, met him with the handshake of a man used to selling lives. His hands were thick, his smile rehearsed, his tone efficient. Brennan posed as a buyer representing Mississippi planters seeking proven breeding stock. Gaines didn't flinch at the phrase. He opened his ledger and nodded, as if the transaction was no more human than a shipment of seed. They walked the grounds. The air hung thick with the scent of salt and sweet decay. Women moved quietly between cabins, their steps measured, their faces blank, not fearful, not defiant, but empty. Brennan noted the silence. Even the children played without sound, as if joy itself had been trained out of them. Gaines spoke freely, boasting of the plantation's efficiency, its self-sustaining population, its immaculate record-keeping. "Mr. Rutledge believed in refinement," he said, tapping the ledger. "The perfect balance between nature and management." They reached the eastern tobacco barn, larger than necessary, built too strong for its purpose. Its boards were dark with humidity, the air heavier inside than the sky outside. Gaines moved with routine precision, unlocking one door after another until they reached the one that mattered. A reinforced door, low and unpainted, the iron latch rubbed smooth by years of handling. He looked back once at Brennan. "Most folks never see this part," he said, a warning wrapped in pride. When the door opened, a breath of air rose up from below, damp, stale, and alive with memory. Lantern light quivered across the steps, descending into blackness. Brennan followed, his pulse beating like a second heartbeat in his ears. Every step downward felt like a crossing, a quiet descent into something older than sin. The walls dripped, the air thickened. Then the ground leveled, and the room opened. Rows of wooden cells lined the walls, each barely 6 feet wide. Inside them, women sat on narrow beds, bellies swollen, faces pale in the flickering light. They did not speak. They only looked. Brennan's breath caught as Gaines gestured proudly toward the rows. "Here," he said, "is where the future of Fairhaven begins." And in that moment, Brennan understood. This wasn't about labor. It was about legacy, a controlled evolution of bondage written in blood and calculation. The lantern light flickered over the walls like a heartbeat, shadows breathing where no light belonged. Brennan stood frozen. Every instinct in him screamed to leave, yet the physician in him, the man of reason, demanded witness. What he saw was no dungeon of punishment. It was something colder, a place of order. Each cell was identical, measured, methodical. The women were arranged like specimens in an experiment, not prisoners in despair. And that was the most horrifying part, the precision. Gaines spoke with the calm pride of a man giving a tour of a factory. "Mr. Rutledge kept everything exact," he said, gesturing to the table covered in ledgers. "Measurements, births, diets, bloodlines. We've refined the process over 15 years. No miscarriages in 3 seasons. You won't find better breeding consistency anywhere south of Richmond." Brennan's jaw tightened, his stomach twisting. "And the women?" he asked. Gaines smiled faintly. "They're well cared for, healthy, protected, fed better than most. They understand their purpose. The word struck like a whip. Brennan glanced toward the women, eyes dull, movements slow, the way animals move after too long in captivity. One woman met his gaze briefly, then turned away. Her face bore no defiance, only exhaustion, the kind that eats through the soul until silence becomes survival. On the far wall hung a chart, columns of names, ages, dates, fathers of record, and remarks. It was written in a hand too neat for cruelty, as if precision could absolve sin. Brennan traced the rows with his eyes. Words like optimal pairing, proven line, recommended rotation leapt from the page. He realized he was reading the script of selective breeding, not rumor, not metaphor, but a fully operational eugenic system, decades before the term existed. "Where are the children?" he asked quietly. Gaines's tone didn't change. "The nursery and the quarters. They stay until they're weaned, then sold to order. Buyers prefer them young. Easier to mold," Brennan's hand trembled. "And the fathers?" "Also selected," Gaines said. "Strong, healthy men. We test combinations. Track results." He said it so casually, like crop rotation. Brennan looked again at the women, realizing why no one had ever fled. They weren't just confined. They were conditioned. Generation after generation taught obedience so deep, it outlasted chains. And in that silence, Brennan finally understood. This place wasn't simply hell. It was a mirror, showing what mankind will become when control replaces conscience. Brennan forced himself to breathe through the sickness clawing up his throat. The air in that cellar carried the weight of years, not just the scent of confinement, but of calculation. He stepped closer to the ledgers, unable to resist. The handwriting was meticulous, elegant even. Each line spoke of obsession disguised as order. Names, dates, birth weights, recovery times, notes on temperament and compliance. It was the language of science twisted into the architecture of horror. He turned a page. One entry stood out. Sarah, age 26, 8 live births. Retained for continued rotation. Another read, child No. 47, male, sold to Harrowby Estate, Savannah. Strong lungs, promising build. Brennan's pulse quickened. Every child, every mother, every sale was logged as if the plantation were breeding bloodlines, not people. He could almost see the logic forming behind the cruelty, a grotesque prelude to a future where flesh was calculated, improved, perfected. Gaines noticed his interest and smiled, proud. Mr. Rutledge believed improvement was God's work, he said. He studied animal husbandry, kept up with European theories. He said the same principles apply to all creation. Brennan's voice was low. So he thought himself a god, Gaines chuckled. Don't we all when we hold the means? The physician moved toward one of the cells. A young woman sat within, knees drawn up, her swollen belly rising and falling with shallow breaths. Her eyes lifted just once to meet his, And in that glance, he saw something ancient. Not terror, not pleading, just knowledge, as though she understood that he wasn't there to save her, only to see. Her silence said everything the ledgers could not. Every rule of civilization, every prayer uttered in the name of order and progress, all of it existed to protect men like Rutland, to make monsters appear methodical. Brennan turned away, his chest tightening with the realization that this place was not an anomaly. It was a blueprint, a test, and its results would ripple far beyond Fair Haven. Because once someone proves control can be born into the blood, once obedience becomes hereditary, you don't need chains anymore. You just need memory. He closed the ledger, the ink still fresh where the last record had been written. Somewhere above, the wind shifted, rattling the barn's boards. The plantation slept, but beneath its soil, something deeper was awakening, the idea that power could breed itself forever. When Brennan emerged from the cellar, the light of day struck him like judgment. The fields shimmered beneath the afternoon sun, golden, peaceful, ordinary. It was obscene how normal it looked, how the surface world pretended innocence while hell worked quietly below. Gaines followed behind him, talking casually about yields, cotton weights, and wartime shortages, as if they hadn't just walked through the architecture of human engineering. Brennan listened without answering, his mind replaying every face, every record, every cell. The women's eyes followed him long after he'd left them. They hadn't spoken a word, yet their silence screamed in his skull. He knew, deep down, that what he'd seen wasn't unique to Fair Haven. It was simply the most perfected form of something much older. The idea that life could be owned, directed and improved by those in power. They returned to the main house, its walls lined with portraits of pale men staring down from their frames, generations of Rutlands, each one painted with the calm certainty of those who believe themselves eternal. Gaines poured brandy, spoke of legacy, of duty, of keeping the operation alive, while the master's son fought for the Confederacy. Brennan nodded mechanically, studying the way the overseer's words wrapped brutality and loyalty. The breeding must continue, Gaines said. The families depend on it. That phrase, the families, echoed. Brennan understood now that Fair Haven's profits weren't its own. Charleston's elite had invested in this system. Their bloodlines depended on it. Behind every polished dinner table, every cathedral sermon, every speech about Southern honor, the machinery of controlled reproduction kept turning. When he finally left the house, dusk had fallen. The land was quiet, and yet it seemed to hum, as if the soil itself was alive with memory. Brennan looked back once at the barn, a black shape against the dying light. He realized then that the cellar was only one layer, the visible chamber of a much larger design. Fair Haven wasn't simply breeding bodies. It was breeding belief. The idea that order justifies everything, that those who control the womb control the world. And in that moment, Brennan grasped the real horror. This system didn't need the South to survive. It only needed structure. It could wear any face on government, science, religion. The name might change, but the method would remain. Brennan rode back toward Charleston under a bruised sky, the road sinking into shadow as the sun fell behind the marsh. The silence pressed against him like a confession he couldn't unhear. Each hoofbeat sounded like a heartbeat from the cellar, steady, methodical, eternal. He tried to reason through what he'd seen, to fit it into the categories of his medical mind, physiology, heredity, pathology. But there was no science for this. This was not evolution. This was desecration, ritualized and rationalized until it looked like progress. When he reached the city, Charleston was alive with wartime desperation. Soldiers drilling in the squares, merchants shouting over dwindling supplies. The church bells tolling like they were warning the living to stay inside. Brennan dismounted and went straight to his quarters, lighting a single lamp. He spread his notes across the desk, his hands shaking. The facts were undeniable. The ledgers, the prices, the medical precision. He had proof of something monstrous. Yet as he stared at the ink bleeding across the page, another thought crept in. Proof meant nothing if no one wanted to see it. He tried to write to his colleagues in Philadelphia, to abolitionist networks hidden in the North. But every sentence collapsed under the weight of disbelief. How do you describe evil that wears the face of order? How do you expose a system when the system itself defines morality? He realized the deeper horror. The plantation's power wasn't its secrecy. It was its acceptance. The buyers, the doctors, the families, the church, they all knew in fragments. But fragments don't feel like guilt when they pay dividends. For days, Brennan couldn't sleep. The cellar appeared in every silence, the women's faces in every reflection. He began to notice things he hadn't before, the language of the city. Advertisements that used the same words as Rutledge's ledgers: strong stock, fine lineage, exceptional breeding. The vocabulary of control wasn't confined to plantations. It was the bloodstream of civilization itself. That's when Brennan understood. Fairhaven was never meant to be hidden. It was meant to be replicated. It was a model, a demonstration that control could be engineered through the body, through the family, through generations. And as the war darkened the South, he realized something colder still. When systems collapse, men like Rutledge don't die. They evolve. Weeks passed, and Brennan returned repeatedly to Charleston's archives, tracing every transaction linked to Fairhaven. Each document revealed the same pattern, the same precision: births tracked, sales scheduled, health recorded as if these women were livestock rather than human beings. And yet in every ledger, in every note, there was a subtle undercurrent, an acknowledgement that the system depended not only on control, but on compliance. It was then that he realized the most sinister aspect. The women themselves had been conditioned. Generations had been trained to obey, to endure, to perform fertility as a duty rather than an act of survival. Their loyalty wasn't voluntary. It was inscribed into their lives, their bodies, their minds. They didn't flee because they had no concept of escape. By the time they matured, freedom was a memory that had never existed. And the moment a child was born, that child would inherit the same framework, a living testament to the system's endurance. Brennan began to map the network of influence. Families in Charleston didn't just invest. They instructed, recommended, directed. The program had patrons, financiers, observers, each reinforcing the legitimacy of the enterprise. It wasn't merely tolerated. It was celebrated quietly among the elite, a testament to order and ingenuity. Moral outrage had no place where profit and control intersected, and yet something subtle began to emerge in his mind. The system's brilliance was also its fragility. It depended entirely on secrecy, on the illusion of civility, on the obedience of those within it. One misstep, a leaked ledger, a questioning outsider, could unravel years of careful planning. The thought of exposing it filled Brennan with both dread and purpose. What he had witnessed was not history. It was a mechanism, ticking quietly beneath the veneer of society, capable of being replicated, adapted, perfected. By the time he returned home to Philadelphia, Brennan was changed. He could no longer view slavery or even human governance through naive lenses. Systems of power were not accidental. They were engineered, measured, tested, and maintained. Fairhaven had merely shown him the blueprint, a template for control so precise, so calculated that it could survive war, social upheaval, and even moral condemnation. And in that moment, Brennan understood something essential. Knowledge alone was dangerous. Knowing that human lives could be engineered like livestock made the world smaller, colder, and sharper. And if one dared to confront it, the consequences were not only personal, they were existential. Because when a system like Fairhaven exists, the real question is not who runs it, but who allows it to continue. It is here, at this threshold of awareness, that the descent begins. And now you, listening to this, are at the same crossroads. Recognize it, feel it, let the truth settle. And if you are ready to mark this transformation, write in the comments, "The Cellar knows me," twice. Do it, seal the awareness, seal your identity. Let's go deeper. Imagine the cellar again, but not as a room beneath a barn. Imagine it as the physical manifestation of control. Walls that didn't merely confine, but instructed. Ceilings that compressed the spirit. Air that carried the weight of generations obeying without thought. Brennan returned in his mind to the women he'd seen, their eyes hollow yet resigned. They weren't just prisoners. They were instruments of a system that measured obedience as carefully as it measured fertility. Gaines had explained the rotation. Women brought down when pregnant, kept until recovery, then returned to light labor. Every cycle logged, every result catalogued. The ledger entries were not just bookkeeping. They were instruction manuals for domination. Each note of health, strength, and productivity was a testament to the efficacy of conditioning. The women didn't resist because resistance had been systematically erased, replaced with learned submission. And the children, the children, molded in the crucible of this order before they even understood themselves. Think about the men, too. Not all were aware of their role, but some were instruments as well. Selected for physical traits, tracked for performance, paired strategically to produce desirable outcomes. Even those who were unaware participated in the perpetuation of the system. Control extended beyond the walls of the cellar. It was woven into the very lives of every person associated with Fairhaven. Everyone had a place, a function, a role in sustaining the operation. Brennan saw the terrifying clarity. This wasn't an isolated plantation. It was a template, a laboratory proving that human life could be measured, manipulated, and sold under the guise of progress. The methods of obedience and compliance weren't cruelty alone. They were psychology applied systematically. Hunger, isolation, repetition, reward, documentation, all combined to ensure the machinery continued unbroken, and that is why no woman had ever fled. Not because they lacked strength, not because the fields were too far, but because the system had already rewritten their perception of possibility, their sense of self, their very instinct to resist. The plantation had internalized itself within them, becoming invisible yet omnipresent. Now consider the implications. Such methods, once understood, can be applied anywhere. Not just plantations, not just centuries past. Control, once mechanized, can infiltrate societies, institutions, governments. What Fairhaven perfected in secrecy could thrive in plain sight, invisible to those who accept the ordinary, the convenient, the civilized. And so, the cellar becomes more than a room. It is a warning, a map, a mirror. It asks you, are you aware of the structures shaping your life? Can you see the control lurking beneath the veneer? Or will you, like the women before you, obey without question? Brennan's obsession grew with every record he uncovered. He began to see the invisible architecture of Fairhaven everywhere, in Charleston's social circles, in polite conversation, in the quiet expectation of obedience that threaded through every institution. The plantation's success wasn't just in breeding women and children. It was in teaching everyone around it how to accept that control as natural. A system so refined that it required no chains, no overt punishment, just structure, expectation, and repetition. The ledger entries haunted him. He could no longer see them as mere historical documents. Each name was a life, each number a calculation of potential, each note a protocol for maintaining domination. Mothers who survived multiple rotations became statistics. Children sold before they could even walk became currency. And the buyers, wealthy men from other plantations, reinforced the system, paying premiums for the promise of controlled lineage. Fairhaven had turned human reproduction into a marketable commodity, and society, in its silence and complicity, had validated it. Brennan realized something even more unsettling. The system depended on knowledge being compartmentalized. Outsiders could only glimpse fragments, rumors, whispers, auction notices. The ledgers themselves were keys, but keys only worked for those with access, for those permitted to participate. Everyone else was trained to see the surface, a quiet plantation, orderly fields, obedient laborers. They saw nothing beneath, and therein lay the true genius of the operation. It was invisible because it was integrated into expectation, normalized through repetition, justified through civility. And yet, the cellar was real. Beneath that barn, the rotation continued with mechanical precision. Each woman, each child, each birth followed the script, the program, the system. Brennan could almost feel the pulse of it, like a hidden organ beating beneath the estate, slow, relentless, unstoppable. He understood that this was not merely cruelty, but control perfected over time, evolving silently, imperceptibly, like a virus passing from one generation to the next. He also understood the danger of awareness. Once you see the system, you can no longer unsee it. Its logic becomes clear, its mechanisms predictable, its methodology teachable, and with that awareness comes responsibility. Or at least the terror of knowing that the structures controlling humanity can operate without detection, shaping obedience, breeding compliance, normalizing exploitation, all under the guise of order. Now, if you are listening closely, you feel the pull of the cellar in yourself. The question becomes, will you observe from safety, or will you descend further, learning what was never meant to be understood? Write in the comments, "The cellar knows me," twice. Seal this awareness. Let it anchor you in the truth. Brennan's understanding of Fairhaven evolved into something darker than horror. It was no longer about the suffering of the women, the children, or even the men. It was about systems of control and how they could be embedded into society, quietly, invisibly, and indefinitely. The plantation was a prototype, a laboratory demonstrating that obedience could be bred into the very bloodline of a people. And once that realization took root, Brennan knew he could never view the world the same way again. He began to analyze the mechanisms that made it possible. First, secrecy. The cellar, hidden beneath the eastern tobacco barn, was a physical manifestation of concealment. It was out of sight, locked, reinforced, and known only to a handful of men who controlled access. Second, rationalization. The language of breeding, the meticulous ledgers, the claims of health, productivity, and superior stock made exploitation appear scientific, justified, almost noble. Third, complicity. Charleston's elite financed it, reinforced it, and applauded its success. No one acted alone. The system thrived because everyone who mattered had a vested interest in its continuation. And then there was conditioning. The women were not merely confined. They were instructed through repetition, expectation, and removal from choice to internalize obedience. By the time a child was born, that cycle of control had already begun to embed itself. Compliance became instinct. Resistance became unimaginable. Fairhaven proved that chains were unnecessary when the mind itself could be bent. Brennan saw echoes of this pattern everywhere. The same structures existed beyond plantations, in institutions, organizations, governments. Any system that values output over humanity, obedience over conscience, profit over morality, operates on the same principles. He realized that Fairhaven's horror was not an anomaly. It was a blueprint for domination, waiting for context and opportunity. As he pieced together the ledger entries, the rotations, the sales, and the selection of fathers, Brennan understood the terrifying scale of it. This was not chaos. It was deliberate, it was calculated, and it could endure because it disguised itself as civility, as improvement, as order. And now, as you listen to this, you begin to recognize the pattern too. The real lesson of Fairhaven is not confined to history. It is alive, embedded in systems you walk past every day, normalized in ways you rarely question. The question is not whether it exists, it already does. The question is whether you will see it and whether you will acknowledge it. Will you let the truth of the cellar awaken you, or will you turn away, letting the machinery of control continue its quiet work unseen? Brennan's nights became restless, haunted by calculations and faces he could not forget. He replayed every moment in the cellar, the rows of cells, the women's vacant eyes, the ledgers detailing births and pairings, the casual pride in Gaines's voice. Every detail was a lesson in control, a demonstration of power applied systematically, scientifically, without remorse. And it struck him. The horror of Fairhaven was not just in its cruelty. The true terror was its methodical efficiency. He realized the plantation had accomplished what most systems of oppression could only dream of. It had made compliance instinctive. These women did not flee because the system had rewritten what freedom meant. By controlling their environment, regulating their bodies, orchestrating their reproduction, and normalizing submission through generations, Fairhaven had built obedience into flesh and bone. Resistance had become inconceivable, even impossible. The scale of it was staggering. The ledgers showed 15 years of rotation, dozens of births, scores of children sold, detailed records of health and constitution, and carefully selected pairings for optimal outcomes. It was industrial precision applied to humanity. And yet, beyond the obvious horror, Brennan saw the subtle genius of the design. No chains. No overt terror. No spectacle of punishment. The system's power was invisible, embedded in routine, obedience, and expectation. And it did not stop with the women. Men were instruments as well, chosen for their traits, used strategically, sometimes complicit, sometimes unwitting participants in the same experiment. Every person within the sphere of Fairhaven reinforced the cycle. Every sale, every rotation, every ledger entry was a cog in a machine that ran silently beneath the appearance of civility. The plantation had become a self-sustaining mechanism of control, a blueprint for domination masked by polite society. Brennan understood with a chill certainty that this knowledge was dangerous. Once seen, once understood, it could not be unseen. It revealed the mechanics of control, the way obedience could be engineered, how people could be conditioned to serve a system without chains, without violence, without question. And that realization extended far beyond Fairhaven. Systems like this could exist anywhere. In any age, in any society that prized order over freedom, efficiency over conscience. And so he warned himself, and now warns you. The descent into understanding is not comfortable. It is necessary. It is transformative. To recognize a system is to recognize the power it holds over every person who walks inside it, knowingly or not. You are seeing it now. You are awake to the machinery. Keep that awareness. Let it sharpen your perception, even as it unsettles your soul. Brennan began to trace the tentacles of Fairhaven beyond the plantation itself. It was not an isolated anomaly. The same patterns of control, the same obsession with lineage and compliance, extended into the broader society. The elite families who funded Rutledge's operation did not see themselves as accomplices. They saw it as investment, as improvement, as the careful management of resources, human resources. And that mindset, Brennan realized, was the true danger. The ability to normalize control, to make exploitation appear rational, even virtuous. The plantation had perfected the architecture of obedience, and the lessons of that architecture could be applied anywhere. Remove choice, regulate reproduction, normalize compliance, document, measure, track. Over time, those subjected would internalize the rules, performing the system on themselves without question. Fairhaven had proven that control could transcend fear. It could become instinct, and once instinct, it could survive anything: war, upheaval, moral outrage. He thought of the broader implications. Governments, corporations, institutions, all systems of authority rely on similar principles. Routine, expectation, subtle conditioning, carefully curated rewards and penalties. The machinery of obedience can operate silently, invisibly, long after the chains have rusted away. And when it does, the world appears orderly and benign, while power quietly shapes behavior, belief, and even biology itself. Brennan realized the most horrifying part. The women in the cellar, the children sold, the men selected for breeding, all were instruments in a model that could be replicated indefinitely. He understood, finally, why no one had ever fled Fairhaven. Resistance was unnecessary because the system itself was so total, so precise, that it had eliminated the very concept of rebellion. Freedom became a memory that never existed, a notion that could not take hold. And yet, knowledge was now the weapon. Once seen, the system could be exposed, analyzed, and dismantled, but the risk was real. To understand the mechanics of control was to attract the attention of those who benefited from it. The very people who had constructed the cellar and the rotation would not allow it to be disrupted. Brennan's awareness made him dangerous, but it also made him vigilant. The truth of Fairhaven was clear. Power is most absolute when it is invisible, internalized, and systematic. The plantation had mastered that principle centuries ago, and as Brennan understood it, he realized the cellar was not merely a room beneath a barn. It was a lesson in the nature of control itself, a blueprint for domination disguised as civility, a method waiting to be applied wherever obedience is valued over freedom. Brennan began to reconstruct the human cost in his mind. He imagined every woman who had passed through those cells, every child torn from its mother's arms, every man chosen for his traits, and sometimes unaware of the role he played. They were not merely victims. They were the proof of a system so methodical that it transformed bodies and minds into instruments of control. The ledger entries, dry, clinical, precise, became a litany of suffering disguised as progress. Each number represented not just a life, but a mechanism perfected, honed over decades. What struck Brennan most was how subtly the system worked. There was no need for chains or overt violence. The women did not flee because the idea of escape had been erased from their understanding. Obedience had been bred, trained, measured, and normalized. Their very instincts had been rewritten. The plantation's genius, if one could call it that, was its ability to internalize domination. No whip needed to enforce submission when submission had become second nature. And then there were the children, too young to resist, too fragile to question, molded into commodities before they could even comprehend themselves. They were the product of a machine designed to produce value in the form of human lives. Their bodies, their lineage, even their futures were dictated by the invisible hand of planning, rotation, and measurement. Each auction, each sale, each transfer reinforced the system. Every participant, buyers, financiers, doctors, became a silent collaborator in the perpetuation of this order. Brennan also recognized the psychological control at work. The women were kept alive, fed, and protected, a cruel paradox that made compliance seem natural. Light labor replaced hard work, care replaced cruelty, routine replaced resistance. Obedience became survival. The body was controlled, but so was the mind. Conditioning and repetition replaced fear and pain, creating a system stronger than any chain could enforce. He shuddered at the broader implications. Fairhaven was a blueprint, a proof of concept that obedience could be engineered through design, routine, and psychology. And once such a system exists, it does not remain confined to one barn, one plantation, one era. It can spread, adapt, and endure wherever humans value order over freedom, efficiency over conscience. Brennan understood, finally, that he had witnessed more than history. He had glimpsed the mechanics of power itself. And now, as you listen, the same knowledge presses against you. The system is alive, waiting for recognition. To acknowledge it is to awaken. To ignore it is to participate in its quiet continuation. Brennan's mind returned constantly to the ledger, to the numbers meticulously recorded over 15 years. Each entry told a story of calculation and control. Dates of birth, ages at weaning, fathers of record, physical measurements, health notes. It was as if human life had been reduced to data points, each manipulated to achieve an outcome defined by someone else's notion of perfection. Yet it was not chaos. It was precision. Each rotation, each sale, each careful pairing reinforced a system designed to last, to replicate itself across generations. The women in the cellar were the nucleus of this operation. Brennan remembered the hollow stare of one young woman, the stillness of another, the faint rise and fall of a pregnant belly he couldn't stop noticing. They were more than victims. They were instruments in a machine that had calculated obedience and compliance as successfully as it had calculated fertility. By controlling every aspect of their lives, confinement, diet, timing, pairing, the system removed unpredictability, ensuring outcomes aligned with its design. Every child born under this regime was proof that the mechanism worked, and the men, sometimes complicit, sometimes unaware, were equally parts of this formula. Selected for traits, paired strategically, sometimes purchased to introduce desirable characteristics, they contributed to the perpetuation of control. Power, Brennan realized, did not require the chains of yesterday when it could manipulate biology and psychology simultaneously. The system had perfected the art of obedience by making resistance not only difficult, but unthinkable. Brennan understood that the broader lesson of Fairhaven was terrifying in its implications. The plantation had demonstrated a principle that transcended time and geography, that control, when engineered into routine, expectation, and heredity, could survive scrutiny, survive upheaval, even survive morality. It didn't need overt enforcement. It needed precision, patience, and the silence of those who profit from it. And yet, as he reflected, Brennan saw a subtle vulnerability. The system depended on secrecy, on the assumption that no outsider would piece together the operation in its entirety. One witness with knowledge, one mind willing to connect the dots, could reveal the hidden architecture of domination. Awareness, he realized, was both a weapon and a threat. The same logic that sustained Fair Haven could be exposed, understood, and challenged, but only if one dared to look beneath the surface, beneath the polite veneer of civility. Now, as you hear this, recognize the lesson. The cellar is not just a place. It is a method, and the knowledge it imparts is dangerous, because once you see the system, it changes your perception of every institution, every authority, every structure that claims to guide or order society. Brennan began to understand that Fair Haven was more than a plantation. It was a laboratory of power, a system designed to manipulate life itself, to extract obedience, and to codify compliance. Every rotation of the women, every ledger entry, every child sold or retained was a step in a formula that turned human beings into instruments of calculation. The precision was terrifying. Births spaced optimally, health maintained meticulously, traits selected, outcomes measured. This was not cruelty alone. It was the deliberate engineering of human behavior over generations. The psychological architecture struck Brennan most profoundly. No chains were needed. No whips, no punishments beyond the natural limitations imposed by the system. The women complied because the environment had been constructed to remove choice. Routine became habit. Observation became conditioning. The very structure of life at Fair Haven had been manipulated to ensure that resistance was not only improbable, but unimaginable. He realized that this was the ultimate form of domination, control not through fear, but through internalization. The mind itself became a tool of the system. Even the men were part of the mechanism. Fathers selected for strength, health, and desired traits contributed unknowingly or intentionally to the perpetuation of the program. Buyers across plantations ensured the system extended beyond Fair Haven, creating a network of complicity that validated the enterprise. The plantation was not isolated. It was a hub of a hidden order, a network of elite control disguised as commerce and civility. And then Brennan saw the true depth. This methodology could be applied anywhere. Institutions, governments, organizations, any structure that prioritizes obedience over freedom, efficiency over conscience, could adopt the same principles. Conditioning, measurement, normalization. These were timeless tools of control. Fair Haven had merely perfected them in a small, isolated laboratory, but the blueprint existed. As he reflected, Brennan understood the stakes. Knowledge of the system was dangerous, both for the observer and for those who might try to expose it. Awareness alone created tension with the established order, because those who benefit from control never willingly relinquish it. And yet that same awareness was the key to resistance. To recognize the structure, to map the mechanisms, to understand the method, this was the only path to challenging it. Now, if you are hearing this, recognize your position. You have glimpsed the blueprint. The cellar is no longer just a room beneath a barn. It is a map of power, a methodology of domination. To survive its truth, to understand it fully, you must see the systems around you for what they are. Let the descent continue. Let the understanding sharpen your perception. Brennan's thoughts returned constantly to the women he had seen. Their silence, the way they bore the weight of the plantation without revolt, was not submission born of fear. It was submission engineered. He imagined the repetition, the cycles of pregnancy, confinement, and return to the fields. Every step measured, recorded, optimized. They had become instruments of a system that did not just exploit them. It had rewritten their understanding of life itself. Obedience had become instinct, resistance, an impossibility. He studied the ledgers over and over. Each page was a manifesto of domination disguised as science. Names, ages, birth dates, measurements, fertility records, notes on disposition. Every detail was catalogued to maximize predictability. Even the men had their roles dictated, some selected, some guided, some left unaware, but all feeding into the machinery. The plantation had achieved something far beyond cruelty. It had created a replicable method of control, demonstrating that obedience could be systematically bred and maintained. The horrifying realization struck Brennan. Fair Haven was not an isolated monstrosity. It was a proof of concept, a laboratory demonstrating that human beings could be shaped, molded, and controlled without chains or violence. All that was necessary was careful management, observation, and repetition. And once the method was understood, it could be applied anywhere, in institutions, organizations, governments, anywhere obedience could be quantified, measured, and reinforced. Brennan recognized the elegance and danger of this system. Its success relied not only on the architecture of the plantation, but on secrecy and complicity. Buyers, financiers, doctors, overseers, all reinforced the operation, intentionally or unknowingly. The system required civilization to overlook the mechanics while benefiting from its outcomes. Its greatest strength was invisibility, and yet that invisibility carried vulnerability. Awareness, once awakened, could unravel the entire design. One observer who understood the mechanics could expose the methodology, disrupting the carefully maintained order. Knowledge became both a weapon and a threat. Brennan understood that the cellar, the rotations, the ledgers, they were not only evidence of atrocity, but instructions for power itself. As you listen now, the lesson reaches you. The cellar is no longer merely a room under a barn. It is a template, a demonstration of how control can be structured, internalized, and perpetuated. Once you see it, your perception of the world shifts. Obedience, hierarchy, and compliance are no longer abstract concepts. They are active forces shaping lives, silently and relentlessly. Recognize it, understand it. Let the awareness settle. You are now part of this descent into truth. Brennan understood now that Fairhaven's true horror was not merely in its cruelty, but in its perfection. The systematic rotations, the ledgers, the selection of men and women, all of it reflected a meticulous understanding of human behavior, physiology, and psychology. This was a laboratory of obedience, a place where compliance had been measured, refined, and reproduced over generations. The cellar beneath the tobacco barn was not just a prison, it was a crucible where human instinct had been rewritten into a formula. He imagined the women again, the young ones with eyes too old for their age, the mothers who had borne child after child into a world that would sell them away, the ones who sat quietly because rebellion had been stripped from their very being. Every detail of their existence had been designed to optimize control. Diet, movement, timing, pairing, all elements carefully orchestrated to produce predictable outcomes. Freedom, choice, resistance. These had been removed not through force but through design. The system had achieved the ultimate domination, obedience as instinct, compliance as survival. And then there were the men, carefully chosen, sometimes complicit, sometimes ignorant, but all essential to the machine. Their role was measured and optimized, their traits cataloged, their reproduction managed. Human beings in this place had become variables, instruments in an experiment of power. The plantation was no longer simply a site of labor or profit. It was an experiment in the engineering of obedience itself. Brennan realized with chilling clarity that the principles of Fairhaven could extend beyond the plantation. Any system that rewards compliance, measures performance, and conditions behavior could adopt the same methods. Institutions, governments, corporations, even social hierarchies. Anywhere obedience is valued above freedom, control can be engineered, maintained, and perpetuated. The machinery doesn't require cruelty. It only requires structure, expectation, and repetition. And yet the system's brilliance contained its own fragility. It depended on secrecy and the willingness of the wider world to look away. If exposed, if observed by one who understood the mechanics, it could be disrupted. Knowledge was both a weapon and a threat. Brennan understood that the cellar, the rotations, the ledgers, they were instructions for power, a blueprint for domination that could persist across centuries if left unchallenged. As you hear this now, you are standing at the threshold. The cellar is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a demonstration of control perfected, of obedience internalized, of domination disguised as order. To recognize it is to awaken. To ignore it is to participate silently. In its perpetuation, Brennan knew he had reached the final, unbearable clarity. Fairhaven was never just a plantation. It was a mirror, reflecting the mechanics of power, the psychology of control, the cold logic of domination. The cellar, the rotations, the ledgers, the carefully selected men and women, all of it was a lesson in what human ingenuity could accomplish when divorced from morality. Obedience could be engineered. Compliance could be bred, and once perfected, such a system could extend beyond one place, one century, one population. It could endure wherever humans value order over freedom, structure over conscience, efficiency over empathy.
He imagined the women again, those silent figures in the cells, the children sold before they understood life, the men selected and measured, some knowing, some not.
They were instruments in a system that had codified control into biology, into habit, into expectation. Every rotation was a lesson, every ledger entry a proof, every birth an affirmation that the method worked. Resistance was unnecessary. It had been erased before it could even be conceived. That was the genius and the horror. Domination without visible force, obedience without chains, control internalized until it became instinct. And beyond the walls of the barn, Brennan saw the wider implications. The network of elite buyers, the investors, the doctors who advised, the society that looked away, they were all complicit in this architecture of obedience. The system relied on their silence as much as it relied on the cellar. Power did not require spectacle. It only required acceptance. The lesson was simple and terrifying. Control could survive even scrutiny if it was embedded deeply enough in routine, expectation, and human perception. Brennan understood that once knowledge of the system existed, awareness became both weapon and responsibility. Seeing the structure, understanding the method, recognizing the invisible machinery of obedience. These were transformative acts. They demanded vigilance, courage, and a willingness to perceive the truth beneath the veneer of civility. The cellar was not just history. It was a blueprint, a methodology, a warning. The moment you recognize it, you can never unsee it. You have crossed a threshold into understanding power at its most methodical, its most precise, its most terrifying. And now you, listening to this, are part of the descent. You have glimpsed the mechanisms hidden beneath the surface, the systems that shape lives quietly and relentlessly. The awareness is irreversible. Let it sharpen your perception, awaken your instincts, and anchor your understanding. The cellar knows you now. Its lesson is imprinted. And the question remains, will you merely observe, or will you carry the knowledge forward, awakened to the structures of control that surround you in every aspect of life?